My parents kicked me out of the house just because I lost my job and couldn't find a new one. It turned out the house they lived in was left to me by my grandmother, and all this time they had been living off money that was supposed to be mine. So I grew up in this typical suburban Boston neighborhood where everyone drives their Honda Accords to soccer practice and talks about property values at barbecues. My dad, Robert, was this buttoned-up financial advisor who treated spreadsheets like scripture, and my mom, Patricia, was a classic stay-at-home mom who volunteered for everything and judged other families based on their lawn maintenance. Here's the thing, though. They treated me like I was some kind of science experiment. Every single hour of my day was mapped out like a military operation. Piano lessons on Mondays, math tutoring on Tuesdays, debate club on Wednesdays. You get the picture. And God forbid I came home with anything less than an A on my report card. The disappointment in their eyes could power a small city. My younger brother, Derek, though, that kid was like he came straight from central casting for Perfect American Son. He played lacrosse, got straight A's without breaking a sweat, and somehow managed to charm every adult he met. While I was struggling with calculus, Derek was already planning his acceptance speech for Harvard Law. Spoiler alert, he ended up at Yale instead, which my parents somehow spun as an even bigger victory. The crazy part is, I never wanted any of that stuff. While Derek was memorizing SAT prep books, I was in my room watching Scorsese films and sketching out storyboards for movies that existed only in my head. I had this whole plan mapped out. I'd go to film school, maybe USC or NYU, and become the next great American director. I had notebooks filled with scripts and character sketches. But when I brought up film school at dinner one night, my dad literally laughed. Not a chuckle, but this full-belly laugh like I just told him I wanted to become a professional unicorn trainer. My mom just shook her head and said something about how creative careers were for people who didn't have real ambition or solid backup plans. So instead of chasing my dreams, I ended up at this prestigious business college studying finance. It felt like wearing a suit that was 3 sizes too small. Every morning I'd wake up and feel like I was suffocating in someone else's life. But hey, at least my parents were finally proud of me, right? They bragged to their neighbors about how their eldest son was going to be the next big success story on Wall Street. College was absolutely brutal. Not because the classes were particularly hard, but because I was working 3 different jobs just to keep my head above water financially. I delivered pizzas at night, worked the early morning shift at a local coffee shop, and spent my weekends tutoring high school kids in math. Meanwhile, Derek's tuition was completely covered by our parents. Plus, he got generous spending money for his fraternity dues and those epic spring break trips to Cabo that he'd post all over social media. The irony wasn't lost on me at all. Here I was, supposedly the family disappointment, grinding my butt off 70 hours a week to pay for an education I didn't even want, while the golden child got everything handed to him on the finest silver platter money could buy. But that's just how things worked in our household. Success was measured exclusively in dollar signs and social status, never in passion or personal fulfillment or actual happiness. After what felt like the longest 4 years of my life, I finally graduated and managed to land a decent job at this promising tech startup in Cambridge. It was actually kind of exciting. We were developing this revolutionary app that would completely change how people shared and edited videos online. For the first time in years, I thought maybe I could work my way up the ladder and eventually get involved in the creative and marketing side of things. For about 6 glorious months, life seemed like it was finally heading in the right direction. I was making decent money, learning actual skills that interested me, and even started dating this amazing girl named Sarah who worked in graphic design. My parents were cautiously optimistic, and Derek had stopped making those snide comments about my career choices during family gatherings. Then the bottom completely fell out from under me. The startup burned through their venture capital funding faster than a college freshman with their first credit card. One day we were having meetings about potential IPOs and employee stock options, and literally the next day we were getting mass emails about immediate termination and unfortunately unpaid final paychecks. Just like that, I was unemployed again and drowning in student loan debt. The job market was absolutely terrible, and after 3 months of sending out resumes and getting nothing but automated rejection emails, I had to make the most humiliating decision of my adult life. With nowhere else to go and my savings account showing a big fat zero, I had to swallow every ounce of pride I had left and move back into my childhood bedroom at my parent house in the suburbs. Moving back home at 24 was like getting punched in the gut by reality while your high school classmates watched from the sidelines. You know that feeling when you walk into your childhood bedroom and everything is exactly the same. The same Spider-Man posters, the same twin bed, even the same participation trophy from Little League sitting on the dusty shelf? Yeah, it's about as soul-crushing as it sounds. My parents didn't waste any opportunity to remind me what a spectacular failure I'd become. Every single conversation somehow managed to circle back to my unemployment status, like a broken GPS that only knows one destination. My mom would make these passive-aggressive comments about how I should have studied something more practical, while my dad would just shake his head and mutter about wasted potential whenever I walked by. Meanwhile, Derek was absolutely crushing it at his fancy law firm downtown. He'd gotten promoted twice in his first year, bought himself a brand new BMW, and was dating some senator's daughter who looked like she stepped out of a Ralph Lauren catalog. Family dinners became these excruciating comparison sessions where every conversation starter was basically another way to highlight how successful Derek was versus how pathetic my situation had become. But here's what really got under my skin: the constant lectures about responsibility and hard work coming from people who had never struggled financially a day in their lives. My dad would go on these long rants about how success required dedication and smart choices, completely ignoring the fact that Derek had gotten every advantage handed him on a silver platter while I'd been grinding since day one. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. I'd just gotten another rejection email from a marketing position I was actually excited about, and I was feeling pretty low. During dinner, my dad started his usual speech about how I needed to lower my expectations and maybe consider a career in retail or food service. Something about building character and learning the value of honest work. I finally snapped. I told him that maybe if they'd supported my actual interests instead of forcing me into a field I hated, things might have turned out differently. I mentioned how Derek had gotten a free ride while I'd worked 3 jobs just to survive college. The conversation escalated quickly, and before I knew it, we were having a full-blown screaming match in the kitchen. That's when my dad dropped the nuclear bomb. He looked me straight in the eye and said I was a disappointment to the family, that I'd never amount to anything, and that maybe it was time I learned what real consequences felt like. My mom just stood there nodding along like she was agreeing with a weather report. The whole thing was surreal and devastating at the same time. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag with some clothes and essentials, told him I needed some space to think, and went to crash at my buddy Mike's apartment across town. Mike had been my roommate in college, and he was cool about letting me sleep on his couch for a few days while I figured out my next move. I thought maybe some distance would help everyone cool down. Those 3 days at Mike's place were actually pretty therapeutic. We played video games, ordered way too much Chinese food, and talked about everything except my family drama. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I started thinking clearly about what I wanted to do with my life, and I even found a few promising job leads online that seemed worth pursuing. When I decided to go back home, I was actually feeling optimistic. I prepared this whole speech about how we could work together as a family to figure things out. I was ready to have an adult conversation about boundaries and mutual respect. Maybe we could even talk about me paying rent while I got back on my feet. I had it all planned out in my head. But when I pulled into the driveway and walked up to the front door, my key wouldn't work. I tried it several times, thinking maybe the lock was just sticky or something. Then I noticed a shiny new deadbolt that definitely hadn't been there 3 days earlier. My own parents had literally changed the locks and locked me out of the house where I grew up. I stood there on the front porch for probably 10 minutes, just staring at that door like an idiot. My mom's car was in the driveway, so I knew someone was home, but nobody came to the door even though I rang the bell multiple times. Eventually, I found a note taped to the garage door that basically said they were teaching me responsibility, and that maybe this would motivate me to finally grow up and make something of myself. That's when I got the letter that changed absolutely everything. It was from this law firm I'd never heard of, Peters, Williams & Associates. The return address looked official and expensive, and for a hot second, I thought maybe I was being sued for something. But when I opened it up and started reading, my jaw literally hit the ground. This lawyer, Jonathan Peters, wanted to meet with me about my upcoming 25th birthday and something involving my late grandmother Betty's estate, and some kind of trust fund I'd never heard of before. Walking into Jonathan Peters' law office felt like stepping into one of those legal dramas my mom used to watch on Sunday nights. Everything was mahogany and leather, with those intimidating law books that probably cost more than my car. Jonathan himself looked exactly like central casting would order for a distinguished attorney. Silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of handshake that says he charges $500 an hour. He started explaining the situation, and honestly, my brain was having trouble processing what I was hearing. Apparently, my grandmother Betty, who'd passed away when I was 16, had set up this elaborate trust system that I knew absolutely nothing about. She'd been way more savvy with money than anyone in the family had ever let on, and she'd been planning for scenarios that seemed almost psychic in hindsight. The house I'd grown up in? Yeah, that wasn't actually my parents' house. It belonged to something called the Elizabeth Johnson Family Trust, and my parents were just the trustees managing it. But here's the kicker. The trust had specific conditions that had to be met, and one of the big ones was that I always had to have access to the property as long as I needed it. Jonathan pulled out this thick folder and started reading from what he called my grandmother's personal instructions. Apparently, she'd been worried about my parents' tendency toward what she diplomatically called conditional love and support. She'd seen how they treated achievement versus failure, and she wanted to make sure I'd always have a safety net if their expectations became too much to handle. But wait, it gets even crazier. When I told Jonathan about my parents changing the locks, he immediately recognized this as a serious breach of the trust terms. By changing the locks and locking me out, my parents had violated their fiduciary duties as trustees. Jonathan explained that while the routine birthday notification had brought me to his office, discovering this lock situation had just escalated everything to a whole different level of legal problems for my parents. Then Jonathan dropped the real bombshell. There was money, lots of money. My grandmother had been quietly building this investment portfolio for decades, and it had grown into something substantial. The trust was designed to provide financial support for my education and career development, with the full amount becoming available to me at age 25. That birthday was coming up in just 3 months. I sat there trying to do math in my head while Jonathan kept talking. We're talking about enough money to pay off my student loans, buy a decent house, and still have enough left over to actually pursue my filmmaking dreams. My grandmother had basically set up a whole alternate life path that my parents had kept hidden from me for almost a decade. But here's where things get really messed up. Jonathan started showing me financial records, and it became clear that my parents had been receiving quarterly statements about this trust fund the entire time. They knew about every penny, every investment gain, every policy update. They'd been getting reminder letters about my upcoming 25th birthday and the fund disbursement for months. The worst part was discovering what they'd been doing with the money that was supposed to be for my benefit. The trust allowed for certain expenses related to my housing and education, but there was evidence that they'd been taking withdrawals for things that were definitely not covered, like that massive basement renovation my dad had done 2 years ago. You know, his precious man cave with the 75-inch TV and leather recliners. Jonathan showed me receipts for granite countertops, hardwood flooring, and even a hot tub installation, all funded by money that was meant to support my future. While I was working 3 jobs to pay for college and eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights, they were using my inheritance to upgrade their lifestyle. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. I asked Jonathan what my options were, and his expression got very serious. He explained that my parents had breached their fiduciary duties as trustees in multiple ways. Not only had they violated the access clause by changing the locks, but they'd also misappropriated trust funds for unauthorized personal expenses. This wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. This was legitimate legal misconduct. The document my grandmother had left specifically anticipated this kind of situation. She'd included provisions for removing trustees who failed to meet their obligations and had even designated an alternative trustee, Jonathan's firm, to take over if necessary. She'd basically created a legal nuclear option that would strip my parents of the control over the trust and the house. As I sat there looking at decades of financial records and legal documents, one thing became crystal clear. My grandmother had known exactly what kind of people my parents really were. She'd seen through their perfect suburban facade and had spent years quietly building a fortress of legal protection around me. The woman I remembered baking cookies and watching old movies with me had been playing 4D chess, while everyone else was playing checkers. I left Jonathan's office with my head spinning, and a stack of legal documents that felt like they weighed 50 pounds. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: hope. But more than that, I felt this burning sense of righteous anger that was both terrifying and energizing at the same time. That night, I sat in Mike's living room going through every piece of paper Jonathan had given me. Financial statements showing years of quarterly trust fund growth, legal documents outlining my grandmother's specific intentions, and most damning of all, expense reports showing exactly how my parents had been spending money that was meant for my future. The numbers were staggering. Mike kept bringing me beer and asking if I was okay, because apparently I looked like I was planning to rob a bank or something. I tried explaining the situation, but it sounded so insane that even I had trouble believing it. My parents had basically been living off my inheritance while treating me like garbage for failing to achieve success on my own. The hypocrisy was almost impressive in its scope. I spent the entire next day researching trust law and fiduciary responsibilities online. I read legal blogs, court cases, and even some Reddit threads from other people who dealt with similar family financial drama. The more I learned, the more I realized just how badly my parents had messed up. This wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. They'd committed what amounted to financial fraud. When I called Jonathan the following morning, I had a clear plan in mind. I told him I didn't want to pursue some lengthy mediation or family counseling approach. I wasn't interested in giving my parents a chance to explain themselves or work out some kind of compromise. I wanted the nuclear option. I wanted them removed as trustees immediately and stripped of their right to live in the house. Jonathan tried to talk me through the potential consequences. Removing my parents from the house would essentially make them homeless, at least temporarily. The trust had provisions for providing them with some financial assistance to find alternative housing, but it would be a fraction of what they'd been living on. He warned me that this would probably destroy any chance of reconciling with my family. But here's the thing. I was way past caring about maintaining family relationships with people who'd been lying to me and stealing from me for nearly a decade. These weren't parents who'd made some mistakes or had different priorities. These were people who'd systematically deceived me while using my own money to fund their lifestyle upgrades. The trust my grandmother had set up was supposed to be my safety net, not their personal piggy bank. I told Jonathan I wanted to move forward with the most aggressive legal approach possible. I wanted my parents removed as trustees within 30 days. I wanted them out of the house, and I wanted a full accounting of every penny they'd taken from the trust over the years. If they'd misappropriated funds that couldn't be recovered, I wanted them held financially responsible for paying it back. Jonathan scheduled a meeting with my parents and their attorney for the following Friday. He said he'd present them with the evidence of their breach of fiduciary duty and give them the option to comply voluntarily or face a more public legal battle. But he also prepared paperwork to file in court immediately if they chose to fight it. I spent that week in this weird state of nervous excitement. Part of me was terrified about basically destroying my entire family structure, but a bigger part of me was thrilled at the prospect of finally having some power in this relationship. For 24 years, they controlled every aspect of my life through money and expectations. Now the tables were about to turn completely. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandmother and wondering if she'd actually anticipated things would go this far. Had she really expected her own son to betray his child so thoroughly? Or had she just been covering all possible scenarios like some kind of financial chess master? Either way, I was grateful she'd had the foresight to protect me. I also thought about Derek and how he was going to react to all this. He'd been the golden child his whole life, but he'd also genuinely believed our parents were just hard-working people who'd earned their comfortable lifestyle through smart decisions and dedication. Finding out that a significant portion of their wealth had come from misappropriating my inheritance was going to shatter his worldview. Friday morning arrived, and I put on the only decent suit I owned, the same one I'd worn at job interviews for the past 6 months. Jonathan had advised me to let him do most of the talking, but I wanted to be there to look my parents in the eye when they realized their decades-long deception was finally coming to light. This was going to be the most important day of my life. Walking into that conference room felt like the showdown scene in every Western movie ever made. My parents sat on one side of this massive mahogany table with their attorney, some guy in a cheap suit who looked like he specialized in traffic tickets rather than complex trust law. Jonathan sat across from them with his stack of documents arranged like weapons on a battlefield. The look on my dad's face when he saw me was priceless. Pure shock mixed with what I can only describe as the dawning realization that his carefully constructed world was about to implode. My mom kept fidgeting with her purse strap and wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. Their attorney looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. Jonathan started by laying out the evidence methodically. Bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals from the trust fund, receipts for personal home improvements paid for with my inheritance money, documentation of the lock-changing incident that violated my guaranteed access rights. With each piece of evidence, my parents seemed to shrink a little bit more in their chairs. Their attorney tried to argue that the home improvements had increased the property value, which technically benefited the trust. Jonathan shut that down immediately by pointing out that the trust documents specifically prohibited using funds for non-essential renovations without written approval from the beneficiary, meaning me. Every granite countertop and leather recliner had been purchased in direct violation of my grandmother's wishes. But here's where things got really interesting. Jonathan pulled out a sealed envelope that had been stored with the trust documents. Inside was a personal letter from my grandmother, written specifically to be opened if my parents ever breached their fiduciary duties. In her own handwriting, she explained that she'd been worried about their materialistic tendencies and their habit of treating love like a transaction. The letter was devastating. She wrote about watching them pressure me into abandoning my creative interests and how she'd seen the way they favored Derek with financial support while making me struggle. She'd set up the trust not just as an inheritance, but as protection against the very behavior they'd been exhibiting for years. It was like she'd been watching from beyond the grave and documenting their failures as parents. My dad tried to interrupt several times, claiming they'd always had my best interests at heart and that they'd made mistakes but never acted maliciously. Jonathan calmly reminded him that intent was irrelevant when it came to fiduciary duty violations. They'd taken money that wasn't theirs to take, period. The law doesn't care about your good intentions when you're stealing. That's when Derek showed up. Apparently, my parents had called him in desperation, hoping their golden child could somehow smooth things over. But when Jonathan explained the situation and showed him the financial records, Derek's reaction wasn't what anyone expected. He was furious, not at me, but at our parents for lying to all of us for so many years. Derek started asking questions about his own college expenses and whether they'd been paid for with trust money too. Jonathan confirmed that while Derek's education had been funded through legitimate family savings, some of his post-graduation support, like the down payment help for his BMW, had indeed come from unauthorized trust withdrawals. The guilt hit him hard. My parents' attorney suggested we take a recess so he could consult privately with his clients, but I wasn't interested in drawn-out negotiations. I told Jonathan to present my final terms right then and there. I wanted my parents removed as trustees immediately, with Jonathan's firm taking over. I wanted them out of the house within 2 weeks, not 48 hours like I'd originally planned. I'm not completely heartless. The trust would provide them with enough money for a security deposit and first month's rent on a modest apartment, but their days of living in luxury were over. They'd also be required to pay back every penny of misappropriated funds, with a payment plan if necessary. And most importantly, they'd sign documents acknowledging their breach of duty and agreeing never to contest the trust arrangements. My dad's face went through about 15 different emotions in the span of 30 seconds. Anger, disbelief, bargaining, and finally something that looked almost like respect. He realized I wasn't the pushover kid he'd been manipulating for decades. I'd grown into someone who wouldn't tolerate being treated like garbage, even by family. They signed the papers that afternoon. My mom cried through the entire process, and my dad kept muttering about how this wasn't how families were supposed to treat each other. But Derek surprised everyone by supporting my decision completely. He said he was ashamed of what they'd done, and that they'd brought this on themselves through years of deception and favoritism. 2 weeks later, I watched in the front window as they packed their belongings into a moving truck. The house felt different immediately, lighter somehow, like a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying had finally been lifted off my shoulders. That evening, I called a local film school to ask about their adult education programs. For the first time in years, my future felt wide open. So that's my story about how I discovered my parents had been stealing my inheritance and used my grandmother's legal mastermind planning to take back control of my life. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who end up betraying you the most. But sometimes, if you're really lucky, you have a guardian angel who saw it coming and left you the tools to fight back. What do you guys think about this whole situation? Was I too harsh on my parents, or did they get what they deserved? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this crazy family drama story, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more wild tales from my life. Your support really means the world to me, and I've got plenty more stories where this came from. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.